Wyoming Territory, 1882. The wind howled through the gap in the hills like it was mourning something lost. Pearl Hargrove sat stiff in the back of the rattling stagecoach, her gloved hands folded tight in her lap. Her trunk bumped against the wall with every lurch. She kept her chin high, but her heart was somewhere down around her boots. She had been traveling for 5 days, dust in her throat, a letter in her pocket, and not a single soul waiting for her anymore. She had come west as a mail-order bride. A man named Walter Greeley in Fort Laramie had written her 6 letters, all of them stiff but kind. He wanted a wife to raise his 2 small children and keep a clean house. Pearl, plain and alone at 24, had said yes. But when she'd stepped off the coach that morning, hair pinned neat, her Sunday dress ironed, Walter had taken one look at her and frowned. "You are not what I expected," he had said, his tone flat. "You look older in person." "Not what I had in mind." Pearl had stood still, her heart cracking in slow motion. She had tried to offer a smile. "I can still be a good wife, Mr. Greeley. I am steady and I read to children," and he had waved her off like she was a gust of wind. "I changed my mind." And just like that, she was no one. No husband, no home, no purpose. The driver, an older man with a weathered beard, had taken pity and let her ride the coach another day east back toward Cheyenne. But when a wheel broke outside a small ranching town called Willow Creek, they had to stop. It was near dusk when Pearl stepped off the coach again, her boots hitting red dirt. The driver cursed under the carriage while a local ranch hand tried to help him fix the wheel. Horses snorted in the corral across the road, and the scent of hay and smoke hung in the air. She stood there, her small trunk beside her, unsure if she should even speak. Then she heard a voice. "Ma'am. Are you all right?" She turned and saw him tall, broad-shouldered, with a day's stubble and a worn hat in his hand. His shirt was dusty, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hands calloused from work. His eyes were warm, a deep shade of hazel that caught the last of the sun. She started, her voice catching. "I suppose that depends on your definition of all right." He nodded once, stepping closer. "Name's Holden Keats. I run the Bar K Ranch just west of here. You look like you could use a place to sit." Pearl hesitated, her fingers tightening on her skirt. "I do not want to trouble anyone." "You are not a trouble," he said simply. "Come on. My sister's got a warm stove and coffee if you're lucky." Pearl followed. She had nothing else. Holden led her to a modest ranch house with a porch that creaked beneath their steps. His sister, a kind woman named Mary with a toddler on her hip, welcomed Pearl in without question. Over dinner, Pearl sat quietly while Holden asked nothing of her, just passed her the cornbread and smiled when she thanked him. Later, under the flicker of lamplight, Mary loaned her a nightdress and a cot in the corner of the sitting room. Pearl lay awake, hands folded over her stomach, eyes on the dark ceiling. She had been sent away for being too plain. She had been told, in the most polite rejection a man could muster, that she was not good enough to be a wife. But Holden Keats had looked at her, really looked, and he had not turned away. The next morning, Pearl rose early. She helped Mary wash and dry clothes, then offered to read to little Nora, who could not yet speak full sentences but giggled whenever Pearl made animal sounds in the storybook. Around noon, Holden returned from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. "You have plans?" he asked her gently. Pearl shook her head. "No, only the clothes on my back and a trunk full of letters that no longer mean anything." He studied her then, his jaw set. "You can stay here a while if you want. Mary could use help with the young one." She nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you." A week passed. Pearl helped with the cooking, the mending, the reading. She kept her hair tied back and her voice soft. She never imposed. But each day Holden came in from the fields and found her offering him coffee, asking about the cattle, laughing softly at his dry jokes. One evening they sat on the porch together, the sky bleeding pink and gold over the plains. Pearl clutched a shawl around her shoulders. "I heard what happened in Fort Laramie," Holden said, his voice low. Pearl stiffened. "Word travels fast. Small territory. Folks talk." She looked down. "I suppose I should not be surprised. It is not the first time someone found me wanting." Holden turned his head. "He was a fool." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "You do not need to say that." "I am not saying it for your sake," he said. "I am saying it because it is true." She faced him, unsure what to say. He looked at her like he had known her longer than a week. "You have quiet strength. You do not need ribbons or rouge. You are the prettiest woman I have ever seen." Pearl's breath caught. He meant it. She could see it in the way he said it, like it was simply fact, not flattery, not pity. The wind stirred her hair. She looked away, blinking fast. "I was not expecting kindness," she whispered. Holden leaned back, his gaze still steady. "Sometimes what we are not expecting is what we need most." The silence stretched between them, not heavy, just full. Pearl closed her eyes a moment, then opened them. "I do not know what comes next." "Then let it be this," he said. "You stay, help Mary. Let me teach you the land a little. No promises, just see where it goes." She nodded slowly, and for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she felt the ground beneath her feet again. Real and solid, not because she had been chosen, but because she had been seen. The spring thaw came late that year. Snow still clung to the shaded gullies, and the rising creeks ran high with meltwater, but the days stretched longer, and the wind had softened its edge. Pearl stood beside the clothesline behind the house, pinning up Mary's washing with fingers gone pink from the cold. She watched Holden cross the pasture, leading a roan gelding with a torn stirrup. He walked with a quiet steadiness, like the land didn't rush him, and he didn't rush the land. Pearl had learned to read that about him, how he moved slow but sure, how he never spoke to fill silence, only to add something worth hearing. She turned back to her task, but the clothespin slipped from her hand and dropped into the mud. She bent to retrieve it just as Holden's voice reached her. "You ever ride?" he asked, stopping a few paces off. Pearl straightened. "Not since I was 12. My father traded our mare for firewood one winter, said there'd be no use in a saddle when the roof might collapse." He nodded once, like he understood what that kind of winter felt like. "I've got a mare gentle enough for a preacher's child. Thought maybe you'd like to come with me up to the ridge tomorrow. Fence needs checking, and it's good country to see." Pearl hesitated, brushing her palms on her apron. "I've not been far outside town." "No better time than now," he said, adjusting the reins in his hand. "We'll take it slow." The next morning, just after sunup, Pearl mounted the paint mare with more stiffness than grace. Holden stood beside her, tightening the cinch on his own saddle, not offering help unless asked. They rode out past the fields, where frost still clung to the low brush, and followed a narrow trail that climbed toward open hills. Pearl's legs ached before they'd gone half a mile, but she didn't complain. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth, and the quiet between them felt companionable. At the ridge, they dismounted and walked the line of fence, Holden testing each post, Pearl handing him nails from the pouch slung over her shoulder. "You always do this alone?" she asked, watching him drive a nail in with practiced swings. "Sometimes one of the boys from town helps if they want the coin, but I trust my own eyes more than most." Pearl crouched to hold a loose wire in place. "I can see that." He glanced at her, then knelt beside her to check the knot. "You trust easy," she paused. "I used to. Then I learned to wait and watch." Holden gave a short nod, then stood and offered his hand. She took it and rose, brushing dirt from her skirt. "You strike me as someone who sees more than they say," he said, picking up the hammer again. Pearl looked out over the valley below, the distant glint of the river winding through pines. "I used to believe if I stayed quiet, people would think better of me." She turned back, her voice steady. "But that never worked quite like I hoped." Holden stepped closer, his fingers curled loose around the hammer handle. "Maybe you were around the wrong people." She met his gaze. "And now, I think you're just where you need to be." They rode home without hurry, the sun warm on their backs, the horses content. Pearl's knees protested every step, but she didn't mention it. That night, she soaked her feet in a basin and leaned against the bedpost, her thoughts full and quiet. By the following week, Mary had taken to sending her into town with Holden for supplies. Not that she needed help picking out flour or lamp oil, but something about Pearl's quiet way settled tempers in the mercantile, and Holden didn't seem to mind her company. They stood beside the shelves one afternoon, sorting through bolts of muslin. Pearl held up a pale blue one, running her fingers along the weave. "This one would make a fine Sunday dress," she said, half to herself. Holden looked over her shoulder. "You'd wear blue, why not?" He studied her for a moment. "It'd suit you." Pearl folded the fabric over her arm, her cheeks warm. "I wasn't asking for your opinion." "Well," he said, reaching for a spool of thread, "you got it anyway." Outside, as they packed the wagon, the storekeeper's wife passed by and lifted her chin at Pearl, her eyes flicking from Pearl's dress to the way Holden stood close. Pearl turned away, stiff-backed. When they climbed into the wagon, she stayed quiet longer than usual. "You all right?" Holden asked as they turned onto the south road. "Some women don't like what they don't understand," she said softly. Holden kept his eyes ahead. "They don't have to understand." Pearl twisted the edge of her sleeve. "I don't want to make trouble for Mary or for you." "You're not trouble," he said. "Your company I look forward to." She looked at him then, and this time the truth of it sat plain on his face. Evening brought a light rain. Pearl stood on the porch, watching it bead on the railing. Holden came up from the barn, his hat tucked under one arm, hair damp. "I brought in that mare," he said. "She's favoring her off leg." Pearl nodded. "I'll make her poultice tomorrow." He tilted his head. "You know herbs, a little. My grandmother taught me some before she passed." She hesitated. "I'd almost forgotten." "Then I'm glad you remembered." The rain softened, and the last of the light faded over the hills. Pearl stepped back inside, but before she closed the door, Holden spoke again. "That blue muslin," he said, voice lower now, "you should sew it. I'd like to see you in it." Pearl didn't answer right away. Then she looked over her shoulder, met his eyes. "Maybe I will." She shut the door gently behind her, heart steady and full for the first time in years. The blue muslin dress was finished by the second Sunday in April. Pearl had stitched it by lamplight after supper, careful and slow. Her needle slipping through fabric with the same patience she used shelling peas or brushing Nora's hair. Mary had helped her shape the bodice and offered a few of the finer buttons from an old tin she kept in the cupboard. When Pearl tried it on, the sleeves resting just at her wrists and the skirt falling neat over her ankles, she didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. She looked settled. Not grand or showy, but certain, like she belonged to herself. She wore it to church that morning. Holden had already hitched the wagon when she stepped onto the porch. His eyes found her and held still, like he'd forgotten what he'd meant to say. "You gonna stand there while the bell rings twice?" she asked, smoothing the skirt. He cleared his throat. "Not likely." But there was something new in the way he helped her into the seat, like the space between them had grown quieter but closer. The church in Willow Creek was a small, pine-scented building with a steeple that leaned a little east. The pews filled slowly, mostly ranch families and the shopkeeper's wife with her two sons. Pearl slid in beside Mary, and Holden sat behind with one knee bumping the pew in front of him. After the hymn, Reverend Sims spoke about patience, about tending to what grows slow and refusing to pluck the fruit before its time. Pearl listened with her hands folded in her lap, but her thoughts drifted to the way Holden had looked at her like he saw something ripening. Later, outside in the sun, Nora tugged at Pearl's fingers and pointed toward the creek. Pearl followed, lifting her skirts as they crossed damp grass. She helped the child gather flat stones to toss into the shallows, the girl's laughter soft and bright. "Couldn't find you inside," Holden said behind her. He crouched beside them, brushing his thumb across a pebble. "Nora seems to think you're better company than I am. She has good sense." Holden grinned, but it was the kind that didn't stretch wide, just warmed the edges of his face. He glanced at her hands, stained faint with berry juice from the morning's preserves. "You always keep busy. If I don't, I start remembering things I'd rather not." He nodded, then stood, offering her his hand. She took it without hesitation this time, and he helped her up as Nora toddled off toward her mother. They walked a little ways along the creek, the grass brushing their boots. "There's a cabin up beyond that ridge," Holden said after a long stretch of quiet. "Belonged to my uncle. It's empty now. He passed 2 winters ago." Pearl waited, sensing more. "I've been fixing it up. Thought maybe I'd keep it for myself one day." She looked up at him. "You planning on leaving Bar K?" "No, but I've been thinking. A man ought to build something of his own. A space that's his to share if he chooses right." Pearl stopped walking. "You mean to marry someday?" Holden's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "If I find someone who wants the same life I do, nothing fancy, just honest work, quiet evenings. Someone I can bring coffee to in the morning and not have to say much." Pearl's breath caught. "That sounds like a good life." He stepped closer. "Would you want something like that?" She didn't answer right away. The creek kept murmuring behind them, and a bird trilled somewhere in the cottonwoods. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to see that cabin." He nodded once, like that settled it. That evening, after supper, Holden rode out with her to the old cabin. It sat at the edge of a clearing, tucked among lodgepole pines, with a porch barely holding to its posts and a roof patched with care. Inside, it smelled of cedar and old grain, but the hearth was swept clean and the window panes caught the late light. Pearl walked the room, touching the smooth table edge, the shelf with a single chipped cup. "You come here often?" "Only when I need to think," Holden said, resting his hands on the doorframe. "Or when the house gets too loud with chores." Pearl turned toward him. "You're not a man who minds noise." "No," he said, "but I pay attention to the kind that matters." He looked at her then, not with hunger or haste, but like he'd been waiting for her to see what he already knew. "I don't want to rush you," he said, "but I'd like to keep company with you. Honest and proper, if you'd have me." Pearl felt the ground beneath her shift, not in fear but in recognition. She stepped closer, her voice quiet. "I was told once I wasn't what someone wanted." Holden's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I don't need speeches," she added. "But I do need to know you see me, not who I might become, not who I failed to be before." "I see you," he said. "I have every day since that first morning." She reached for his hand and he took it gently. "I'd like to come back here," she said. "Maybe bring some curtains." A second cup. Holden smiled at that, and it lit something peaceful in his face. They stood in the cabin doorway as the last of the light faded, their hands joined, the air between them full of things not needing to be said. The pain of before had not vanished, but it no longer shaped her. What lay ahead was still unknown, but it was hers to choose now, and she would choose him. Pearl stood at the garden's edge, a small trowel in her hand, sleeves rolled and skirt pinned to keep from trailing through the damp soil. The sun had risen slow and silver, warming the frost from the grass as it crept higher. She pressed a seed into the earth, then another, careful to space them as Mary had shown her. There was comfort in the rhythm: dig, drop, cover something sure in a world that had once felt so unsure. Holden's voice reached her from the barn. "You planning to grow enough beans to feed the whole county?" She didn't turn. "Just enough to keep your supper interesting." He came closer, boots brushing gravel. "You always plant in rows that straight. I like knowing where things belong." He crouched beside her, resting his forearm on one knee. "You ever think about what you'd want in a place of your own?" She pressed the soil flat with her palm. "A window that opens, a stove that burns even, a table wide enough for 2 plates and still room to write a letter, even if there's no one to write to." Holden didn't respond right away. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He was watching her hands. "You'd never be writing letters with no one to send them to," he said. She paused. "You saying that to be kind?" "No," he said. "I'm saying it because if you ever sat at a table of mine, I'd be right there with you." They worked the rest of the row in silence. When they stood, Pearl brushed her hands on her apron and looked toward the hills. "Mary said you used to travel cattle up north," she said. "Before Pa passed," he replied. "We'd run herds to Montana every summer. Took near a month, sometimes longer." "You miss it," he shrugged. "It was a good kind of hard." "But there's a different kind of good waiting here." Pearl didn't answer. She watched a hawk circle above the pasture, its wings still as it glided. That afternoon she found Mary by the washtub, sleeves soaked. Pearl took the basket without being asked. "You've changed since you came," Mary said, wringing out a shirt. "You stand straighter." "I didn't notice." "You laugh more, too." Pearl folded a towel. "It feels like something's being built, but I don't know what yet." Mary smiled gently. "Some things don't need naming right away. They just need tending." That evening, Holden returned from town with a bolt of oilcloth and a wrapped bundle he handed to Pearl without saying anything. Inside was a bound journal, the cover worn but clean, the pages lined. "I saw you looking at one like it last month," he said. "Figured you had things worth putting down." She ran her fingers over the spine. "I don't know if they're worth anything." Holden leaned back against the porch railing. "They're yours. That makes them worth something." Pearl looked up at him. "You remember small things." "I pay attention." She opened the journal to its first page, then closed it again. "I don't know where to begin." He tipped his hat back. "Start with the part where you decided to stay." She nodded once, and that night, by the light of a single oil lamp, she wrote one sentence. "I was not sent away, I was sent toward something better." The next morning, she handed the journal to Holden with that page marked. He read it, then looked at her. "You believe that?" She met his eyes. "I do now." He tucked the journal under his arm. "Then let's not waste any more time." They walked toward the barn, the morning sun warming their backs. Pearl felt something settle in her chest, something that had once been fear, now turned to quiet certainty. There were no speeches between them, no promises laid out in grand declarations. Only the steady rhythm of 2 lives beginning to lean toward each other, like vines finding the same patch of sun. She didn't need a wedding date or a ring to know what she was building with Holden. She already knew where she belonged. Holden stood outside the cabin with a hammer tucked into his belt and a length of cedar planks leaning against one shoulder. Pearl watched him from the doorway, sleeves rolled, a twig tucked into the knot of her hair. The roofline still dipped where the old timbers had sagged, but the new ones he'd cut from the draw were stacked clean beside the porch. His shirt clung damp to his back from the morning's labor, and a long scratch ran pale over his forearm. "You didn't need to do all this before asking me," she said, arms crossed lightly. He set the planks down with care and met her eyes. "I didn't want to ask unless I had something worth offering." Pearl stepped down onto the packed earth, her boots quiet. "You think a roof and 4 walls is the part that matters most?" He hesitated, the hammer still in his hand. "No, but it's the part I can put my hands to." She reached out and took the hammer from him, setting it on the porch rail. "I'm not marrying a house," she said. "I'm marrying the man who walked back into town after his heifer broke its leg just to bring me a spool of thread I'd mentioned once in passing." Holden's breath left him in a quiet exhale. "Then I hope you'll say yes." "I already did," she said, voice low. "Just hadn't said it out loud yet." They married 3 weeks later beneath the cottonwoods behind the Bar K house, with Mary humming a hymn while she pinned wildflowers into Pearl's braid. Nora clapped her hands through the whole of the short service, and Holden held Pearl's hand like he didn't mean to let go of it again. Reverend Sims barely had time to pronounce them before Holden leaned in and kissed her. Not rough or rushed, just certain. Afterward, they walked to the cabin together with only the sound of crickets and the hush of dusk around them. Pearl carried the bundle Mary had stitched for her, a simple quilt of pieced calico and soft wool batting. The air held the scent of smoke from the stove Holden had coaxed to life with pine pitch and care. Inside, the table had 2 plates set. A small tin cup of apple preserve stood between them, and beside it, the journal Pearl had begun weeks ago turned to a blank page. "I thought we'd write the next part together," Holden said, lifting the kettle from the hob. Pearl ran her fingers over the worn edge of the binding. "I never knew a life could be quiet and full at the same time." He poured the coffee and set the cup before her. "You make it full." They slept that night with the window cracked, the quilt tucked around their legs and the sound of night birds somewhere in the trees. Holden's hand rested over hers, and Pearl didn't dream of anything but the warmth beside her. By late summer, the garden behind the cabin had taken root. Pearl tended it with bare hands and sun-browned arms, and Holden built a new gate from old fence rails. Mary visited with Nora every few weeks, bringing fresh butter and news from town. Pearl gave her currant jam and mended linens in return. One morning, as the sky turned soft above the ridge, Pearl stepped out with a basket to gather herbs. She paused, pressing her palm flat over her middle, quiet and still. She hadn't felt ill, not exactly, but something had shifted, something steady and new. She didn't speak of it that day, not until they sat together after supper and Holden asked why she kept smiling at nothing. "I think we'll need a 3rd plate before winter," she said. Holden didn't speak for a moment. Then he reached across the table and touched her wrist, his thumb brushing over the skin like a vow. "You're sure?" Pearl nodded once. "I've known my body a long time. It's never lied to me." He stood and came around the table, kneeling beside her chair, hands resting over hers. "I'll build a cradle," he said, "and a chair you can rock it in." Pearl leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. "That sounds like the kind of life I never dared to ask for." "You never needed to," he said. "It was already yours." That winter, snow came early, but the cabin held warm. Holden laid wood in the stove each morning before Pearl rose, and she stitched soft flannel into a wrap for the child that would come by spring. At night, she read aloud from the journal, her voice low, while Holden carved small wooden animals from leftover pine. When the baby came a boy with quiet eyes, and his father's hands, Pearl held him to her chest and wept without shame. Mary was there, steady through the birthing, and Holden never left the porch except to bring water or whisper her name through the open window. Later, when the baby slept between 2 folded quilts, Holden laid beside Pearl and traced the line of her jaw with one calloused finger. "I didn't know what I needed until you came off that coach," he said. "Now I can't remember the shape of life before." Pearl turned toward him, her voice thick with sleep and joy. "Then don't. What we have now is enough to fill the rest. They stayed in the cabin through spring, then summer, and into the next years that came with all their weather. They planted more rows, added a lean-to for grain, and taught their son to walk between the furrows of tilled earth. They never spoke much about the lives they'd left behind. They didn't need to. What had mattered found them here, in the hush of pine and the warmth of hands that held fast through every season. They grew older, as all people do, but the love between them never thinned or bent. It deepened, the way roots do, quiet, unseen, but strong enough to hold everything upright. And they were happy, always,